la presidencia a nombre de mi país. Un honor largo, un gran honor. Quiero agradecer a todos los equipos de los diferentes ministerios de Chile y a los equipos negociadores que se sumaron a esta desafiante labor con convicción, entusiasmo y gran profesionalismo. A los miembros del Buró, a la delegación de Chile y a la de todos los países, en especial de los más vulnerables, que con tanto esfuerzo viajan, muchas veces desde enormes distancias, para participar de este proceso, que debe ser transformador. Y a las miles de personas que desde nuestros países contribuyen para impulsar los cambios. Quiero decirles a todos ustedes que sí valió la pena. Contarles también que la presidencia de la COP permitió a Chile, en momentos muy complejos de fuerte polarización política y social, generar un consenso transversal en nuestro país para construir, reconociendo lo avanzado, y fortalecer una acción climática ambiciosa como política de Estado que trascienda los gobiernos de turnos. Cumpliendo lo establecido en el Acuerdo de París, en Chile, trabajando conjuntamente con la ciencia, logramos aprobar unánimemente en el Senado la Ley Marco de Cambio Climático, que establece la meta de carbono neutralidad y resiliencia a más tardar el 2050, como lo pide la ciencia. Presentar el 2020 nuestra NDC actualizada con ambición en línea con la carbono neutralidad. Desarrollar el Atlas de Riesgo Climático a nivel comunal para todo el territorio nacional, instrumento clave para la adaptación. Impulsar un proceso de descarbonización, estableciendo el cierre inmediato de las primeras plantas a carbón apenas asumimos la presidencia el año 2019 y el cierre al año 2025 del 65% de todas las centrales a carbón en Chile. Y hoy, presentar en esta COP26 nuestra estrategia climática de largo plazo, con límites de emisiones vinculantes para todos los sectores emisores de nuestra economía y más de 400 medidas multisectoriales concretas en un camino claro para alcanzar la carbono neutralidad y resiliencia de nuestro país. Sin duda, son logros importantes. Sin embargo, sabemos que aún nos queda mucho por avanzar. En Chile y en el mundo entero estamos sintiendo con fuerza los efectos del cambio climático. La ciudadanía espera mucho de los líderes en la COP. Nuestra generación no va a detener hoy el cambio climático, pero sí debe hacer con urgencia el cambio de rumbo que necesitamos para detenerlo. Son los jóvenes a quienes sumamos en el proceso de negociación, los que con su fuerza, capacidad de innovación y de trabajar horizontalmente pueden ayudarnos a generar los consensos requeridos para lograr el desarrollo sustentable que todos anhelamos. Quiero agradecer al Reino Unido, con quien trabajamos estrechamente estos 2 años, al presidente entrante, Alok Sharma, quien se ha abocado en lograr el éxito de este proceso, y a todo su equipo, no solo por liderar la COP26, sino por haber hecho todos los esfuerzos por albergar una COP presencial y segura, pese a todas las restricciones sanitarias que impone el COVID. Sabemos que el éxito de esta COP26 se va a evaluar principalmente en 3 áreas: ambición, finanzas y reglas. Hoy tenemos una gran brecha de ambición. El Acuerdo de París establece 2 instrumentos mandatorios para enfrentar el cambio climático: presentar NDCs más ambiciosas y estrategias climáticas de largo plazo. Esos son los dos instrumentos concretos que todos los países debemos utilizar para reducir esa brecha. No hay otros. No podemos reescribir el Acuerdo de París. Tenemos que cumplirlo. Debemos también ser capaces de establecer una nueva meta de movilización de recursos financieros al 2025, pero también cerrar la brecha de los 100.000 millones comprometidos. Por último, necesitamos fijar un set de reglas claras, donde el tema más importante será el marco reforzado de transparencia. No va a haber artículo 6 sin ello. El proceso de la COP se basa en la confianza, así como en el principio de responsabilidades comunes, pero diferenciadas. Es por eso que antes de dejar la presidencia de la COP, quiero hacer un llamado fuerte y claro a los líderes del G20, que hoy se encuentran reunidos en Roma, a cumplir los compromisos adquiridos. Amigas y amigos, soy optimista. Los procesos multilaterales no son fáciles ni rápidos, pero los acuerdos son esenciales. El éxito no está en dividirnos, no está en buscar culpables, ni en derrotar a otros, sino en sumar voluntades que nos permitan cumplir con nuestra palabra y que nuestras acciones realmente reflejen nuestro discurso. Siguen contando con Chile. Muchísimas gracias.
Distinguished delegates, I would like to invite you to turn to sub-item 2 of the provisional agenda for the session, election of the President of the Conference of the Parties at its 26th session. You may recall that, in accordance with Rule 22, paragraph 1 of the draft Rules of the Procedure being applied, the office of the President of the Conference of the Parties is subject to rotation among the 5 regional groups. We now continue the cycle with a President from the Western Europe and other states. It gives me great pleasure to propose that the Conference elect by acclamation His Excellency Mr. Alok Sharma, who will serve as President of the Conference at its 26th session. I declare His Excellency Mr. Alok Sharma elect President of the 26th session of the Conference of the Parties. I congratulate Mr. Sharma on his election and wish him every success in guiding the work of the conference. I now invite Mr. Sharma to take his seat on the podium.
Friends, it's an honour to speak to you today for the first time as COP President. And I want to thank my dear friend Carolina for her really strong leadership over the past 2 years. Friends, I'm very aware of the responsibility placed upon me in this role, and I do not underestimate the challenge. But let me start first by formally welcoming you to Glasgow, and I want to thank you for all your efforts in getting to the United Kingdom, which I know for some has been arduous due to the impacts of the pandemic. Indeed, for almost 2 years now, the pandemic has caused devastation and disruption to lives and livelihoods across the world. And I know this has particularly affected the least developed countries and the small island developing states. And because of the pandemic, as you know, we postponed COP26 by a year. But during that year, climate change did not take time off. And the IPCC report in August was a wake-up call for all of us. It made clear that the lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard. That report, agreed by 195 governments, makes clear that human activity is unequivocally the cause of global warming. And we know that the window to keep 1.5 degrees within reach is closing. I've been humbled to speak over this year with communities devastated by climate change. On a visit to Jomsom in Nepal in the Hindu Kush region, I spoke to communities literally displaced from their homes from a combination of droughts and floods. In Barbuda, I met communities still suffering from the ravages of Hurricane Irma 4 years ago. I've spoken to the communities in East Africa fighting plagues of locusts spawned by climate change. And earlier this month, I spoke to a group of women in Madagascar, determinedly coping with what some describe as the first climate-induced famine in the world. Friends, in each of our countries, we are seeing the devastating impact of a changing climate. Floods, cyclones, wildfires, record temperatures. And we know that our shared planet is changing for the worse. And we can only address that together through this international system. And we know what we need to do, because 6 years ago in Paris, we agreed our shared goals. We said we would protect people and nature from the effects of climate change. We said we would get finance flowing to climate action. And we said we would limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts towards 1.5. The rapidly changing climate is sounding an alarm to the world to step up on adaptation, to address loss and damage, and to act now to keep 1.5 alive. And we know that this COP26, is our last best hope to keep 1.5 in reach. Now, I know that we have an unprecedented negotiations agenda ahead of us, but I believe that this international system can deliver. It must deliver. And as COP President, I am committed to promoting transparency and inclusivity, and I will lead this conference in accordance with the draft rules of procedure and with the utmost respect for the party-driven nature of our process. In that spirit, I believe that we can resolve the outstanding issues. We can move the negotiations forward, and we can launch a decade of ever-increasing ambition and action. And together, we can seize the enormous opportunities for green growth, for good green jobs, for cheaper, cleaner power. But we need to hit the ground running to develop the solutions that we need. And that work, my friends, starts today. And we will succeed or fail as one. Astronauts speak of the intense emotion they feel when looking back at Earth from space, seeing it gleaming through the darkness of the cosmos. incredible, improbable, and infinitely precious. And if we act now, and we act together, we can protect our precious planet. So let's come together over these 2 weeks and ensure that where Paris promised, Glasgow delivers. Thank you. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and honoured guests. This morning, we are honoured to have with us His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Hoesung Lee, Chair of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, Councillor Susan Aitken, Leader of Glasgow City Council, India Logan Riley, a representative of the Indigenous peoples, and Ms. Patricia Espinosa, UNFCCC Executive Secretary. And it is now my pleasure to invite Councillor Susan Aitken, Leader of Glasgow City Council, to address the plenary. Councillor Aitken, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Friends, it is my great pleasure, honour and responsibility to give the 26th United Nations Conference of the Parties the warmest of our famous welcomes to the city of Glasgow. There have been delays and uncertainties on our collective journey here. I'm extremely grateful to everyone who has worked in partnership with us as the host city to get us here to this point. But we are here now, and humanity looks to you and the work that you'll do over the next 2 weeks to fulfil the promise of Paris for a safer, sustainable, more equitable future for us all. Let the city of Glasgow and our people serve as an inspiration to you. This is a city that has been through some very tough times, but we have survived and thrived against the odds through resilience, innovation, imagination, a sense of community, a strong sense of social justice, humour and grit. These are all qualities that you'll need in abundance over the days ahead. And if you feel your determination flagging at any point, please take a walk outside, talk to a Glaswegian, and let the spirit that infuses this city infuse you too. And if, as you spend some time here, you feel yourself feeling a little bit bolder, a little bit bolshier, perhaps with a wee bit more swagger than usual, then that's just the Glasgow effect. Take inspiration too from Glasgow's climate ambition. If this post-industrial city, still living with the legacies of our high-carbon past, can have a plan for net zero by 2030, then there should be no limit on your ambitions either. Let the example of pioneer cities like this one light your way to the actions that you must agree here to safeguard our climate and our ecology for future generations. Glasgow couldn't be prouder of being the host for this pivotal moment for the future of the planet that we all share. Like the rest of the world, we'll be watching and judging. Our demands and expectations of you will be high, but we'll also be cheering you on and wishing you all the heart and courage that you need for the task that you have ahead of you. Once again, welcome to Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Aitken. It is now my pleasure to invite Ms. Patricia Espinosa, UNFCCC Executive Secretary, to address the plenary. Executive Secretary, you have the floor.
Honourable guests, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, our very long wait is over. It is with joy and enthusiasm that I officially welcome you to COP26. I thank the outgoing COP presidency of Chile and especially Minister Schmidt for their leadership in the last 2 challenging years. I also officially welcome the incoming UK presidency and Minister Sharma. I thank you for your collaborative efforts as we work together to make COP26 a resounding success. And to all of you, I say this: congratulations. Congratulations to those in this room, those watching online, and to everyone involved in this process. Think back on the last 2 years since we last met in Madrid. The early confusion, the pandemic, and what it could mean for our process. Think about the decisions we made together, the skills we developed together to take advantage of communication technologies. Think also of those we lost to COVID-19. Our hearts are with those who continue to suffer. But let us also acknowledge what we have accomplished. We have kept the process going. We have not let the pandemic stand in the way of addressing the most critical issue facing this generation and those to come. We are here because of you and your work. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Let's ensure that work was not in vain. As Scottish poet Robert Burns once wrote, "Now is the day, now is the hour." Colleagues, dear friends, we stand at a pivotal point in history. Humanity faces stark but clear choices. We either choose to achieve rapid and large-scale reductions of emissions to keep the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, or we accept that humanity faces a bleak future on this planet. We either choose to boost adaptation efforts to deal with current extreme weather disasters and build resilience to address future impacts, or we accept that more people will die, more families will suffer, and more economic harm will follow. We either choose to recognize that business as usual is not worth the devastating price we're paying and make the necessary transition to a more sustainable future, or we accept that we are investing in our own extinction. It's about much more than environment. It's about peace, stability, and the institutions we have built to promote the well-being of all. It is for these reasons and more that we must make progress here in Glasgow. We must make it a success, as President Sharma has just said. Success at COP, here at this COP, is entirely possible. Success is possible because we have the platform for action. The Paris Agreement is a covenant of hope with humanity. It has everything we need to achieve our climate goals. But to fully unleash its potential, we need full implementation. To get there, parties must finalize outstanding work under the agreement that has remained unfinished for far too long. Every day that goes by without being able to implement the Paris Agreement in full is a wasted day, the accumulation of which have real-world repercussions for people throughout the world, especially the most vulnerable. I call upon parties to complete the necessary work here at COP26 that will move us towards full implementation. Success is possible because we already know the pathway to solutions. The recently updated UN Climate Change NDC synthesis report showed that emissions continue to rise. That's the bad news. The good news is also showed that for those nations providing a new and updated NDC, emissions are projected to decrease by 2030. But the truth is that we need even more ambitions and all nations on board, especially the highest emitters in the G20, responsible for around 80% of global emissions. We also need to see provision of support to developing countries, another cornerstone of the Paris Agreement. With adequate support, emissions reductions can potentially be higher. This relates to the commitment to mobilize 100 billion from developed countries to developing countries. The delivery plan announced last week should be seen as a start, not the end. It's important to follow through with more detailed and concrete actions. But let us be clear, without the necessary support, we will not be able to embark on the transformations needed to achieve the 1.5-degree goal. This is not only about 100 billion. We need to mobilize the trillions. With respect to adaptation, we need to significantly increase financial support, especially for the most vulnerable countries. We need to accelerate the development and implementation of national adaptation plans. A clear path to solutions exists. I call upon all parties to recapture the spirit of multilateralism that resulted in the adoption of the Paris Agreement and fulfill their commitments under it. Success is possible because we have the science. The data is unequivocal. Climate change is widespread, rapid, intensifying, and already impacting every region on Earth, on land, and in the ocean. But one number stands out above all others. We must limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. The IPCC, the NDC synthesis report, and the emissions gap report all tell us, however, that we are not on that path. I call upon all parties to use science to inform their decisions at COP26 and act upon it. Studies and statistics tell one story, but we must look beyond the numbers to the human lives they represent. I have been to the small island states threatened by rising waters. I have talked to school children frightened for their futures. I have talked to women who bear the burden of climate change at home, but are shut out of the search for solutions the minute they go out of the door. I have talked to youth frustrated with what they see as a bleak future. The message they all have in common is this: they want to be included. They are right. If we are sincere in calling climate change a global issue, then total inclusion must be the foundation upon which this process is built. COP26 needs to ensure that all voices and proposals are considered. I encourage the engagement of observers and other stakeholders, and I call upon parties to incorporate their ideas in the discussions here at COP26. We are all facing the same climate emergency. We must all be part of the solution. Dear colleagues, the transition that we need is beyond the scope, scale, and speed of anything humanity has accomplished in the past. It is a daunting task, but humanity is a species defined by its ingenuity. More than 2 centuries ago, the world was completely transformed by the Industrial Revolution. It was an era driven by the technology and innovation of their day, but also one with the residual impacts of greater economic and social division, environmental damage, and climate change. We can and must learn the lessons of history. Let ours be an era defined by the prosperity of the many rather than the short-term gain of the few. Let ours be an era in which we have healthier relationships with nature. Let ours be an era in which we protect our land, oceans, and biodiversity. Let Glasgow be the starting point of this new era, this new age of resilience, and let COP26 mark its beginning. It's entirely within our grasp, but getting there depends on the completion of our work here. It depends on the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. It depends on more climate action. It depends on you. It depends on all of us. Dear friends, the task ahead of you in these 2 weeks is significant. But look at what you have accomplished just to get this far. Success is entirely possible. I encourage you to keep the big picture in mind. I encourage you to look beyond your specific agenda item to what we're trying to achieve together. I encourage you to consider the choices that we must make and the trust vested in you by billions. Let us rise to the enormous challenge of our time, this pivotal point in history, and achieve success for not just our present generation, but all generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. The IPCC is currently in the process of preparing its 6th assessment report and has recently released Working Group 1's contribution to that assessment. I would therefore like to invite Mr. Hoesung Lee, Chair of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, to address the plenary. Mr. Lee, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to address you on behalf of the IPCC at the opening of the COP26. First, our sincere thanks to the UNFCCC Secretariat and the UK government for the successful preparation of this landmark conference. We are equally grateful to the Scottish Government and City of Glasgow for this preparation and warm welcome. It is a privilege to speak about climate change science here in Scotland, endowed with a rich scientific life and home to giants such as Alexander Fleming, Mary Somerville, and of course Adam Smith, the father of economics, just to name a few. Today's scientific knowledge and its achievement stands also on their shoulders. Prior to this conference, the IPCC released in August the first part of its ongoing 6th assessment report. It clearly laid out for the policymakers and stakeholders the most up-to-date physical science basis for the understanding of the climate system and climate change. Make no mistake, it's a sobering read. It reflects the magnitude of the collective challenge for all nations on this planet. Science shows that changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and becoming more intense and affecting every part of the region. Thanks to major advance in science since our previous assessment report in 2013, today we have a much more precise and clearer picture of how the climate system works, which let us understand better what has changed in the past and what is changing now and what can be the changes in the future on the climate system and why they matter for every region. It is now unequivocal that human influence is causing climate change, making extreme events more frequent and more severe. Some recent hot extremes, such as heat waves in the last 10 years, would have been extremely unlikely to occur without human influence on the climate system. Global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during this century unless immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, especially the carbon dioxide and methane, occur in the nearest future. We also bring a wealth of understanding about climate change at the regional level, which is critically relevant for shaping policies. I encourage everyone to seize the moment, seize the opportunity this gathering offers. We, the scientific community, are ready to work with you on the understanding of scientific evidence of climate change, its impacts, adaptations, and how these translate into realities of climate action. We share one atmosphere, one climate system. It knows no borders. The true measure of the effectiveness of our collective efforts will be the state of its condition, and science will attest to that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. It is now my pleasure to invite His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the United Nations General Assembly, to address the plenary. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, allow me to be candid, for you are family. We are facing an existential crisis. We have the capacity and resources to address this crisis, but we are simply not doing enough. We must be honest about this with ourselves, with each other, and with the rest of the world. We have had decades to argue the facts about climate change, but the power of renewables, about the fine details of monitoring or cost sharing. Yet, we have still failed to act with the conviction and determination required. That may be a hard truth, but it is the truth. Another truth: we are entirely capable of turning this around if we so choose. Excellencies, since assuming the role of the President of the General Assembly, I've heard more about climate change than any other subject. I heard it from every single world leader and delegate at the high-level week. I heard it on my travels from youth, from civil society, from local leaders, and from women's groups. I heard it last Tuesday at the General Assembly meeting on climate change that I convened ahead of COP26. While the intensity of their tones varied, their messages were one and the same: the urgency of keeping with 1.5 degrees target, the need to support vulnerable populations, the irresponsibility of not capitalizing on technological innovations, and the importance of empowering women and youth. I promised the membership of the General Assembly that I would bring this message to here, to Glasgow. First, renewable technologies are now among the cheapest on the planet and command strong public support. With the news that climate finance will not reach the promised goal of 100 billion annually until 2023, we must accelerate our efforts to ensure that all countries have access to the latest technological innovations. Second, nearly $100 trillion have been pledged to net zero targets by the private sector. Yet, it is unclear how they will be utilized, prioritized, or measured. It is imperative that their contributions are as efficient and impactful as possible. Third, we must maintain focus on adaptation, particularly for vulnerable countries. We must ensure there is an even 50-50 split in adaptation and mitigation financing. Fourth, green jobs are the future, promising both economic prosperity and environmental sustainability. We owe to the world's almost 1.8 billion youth to not only make the transition to blue and green economies, but to also invest in their skills and tap into their energies to make that transition viable. Excellencies, 6 years ago in Paris, we celebrated an agreement that committed us to keeping global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees. We pledged to protect those most vulnerable, and we acknowledged that this was a planetary problem, that no country could go alone. Yet since Paris, it has rained for the first time on Greenland summit. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has reached record levels. Heat waves have scorched countries around the world. Droughts, storms, forest fires, and floods have all become more intense, more recurrent, and more commonplace. And sea levels are rising, threatening small island states and coastal communities alike. My friends, we have the science, we have the resources, we agree on the urgency. What then is holding us back? My dear friends, only one variable remains, and it is us. We have to make the choice to address climate change. We have to choose the hard but necessary actions. We have to listen to the science and increasingly our global population who are demanding action. My dear, dear friends, we have run out of excuses. It is time to do the right thing. In the words of Frankie the dinosaur who addressed the General Assembly, let us not choose extinction. Let us work together as one global family and use the capacities and capabilities at hand to do what needs to be done. Let us get it done. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Now, upon my special invitation, it is my pleasure to invite India Logan Riley, a representative of the indigenous peoples, to address the plenary. India, you have the floor.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Hello everyone. Ko kahuraniki te maunga, ko toki te awa, ko ngaruroro te awa, ko tūtaikuri te awa, ko ngā takangunu te iwi, te hei Moriora. Ko India Mero Logan Riley aho. My name is India, and I am from a nation called Ngā Takangunu on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, colonially known as New Zealand. In February of last year, catastrophic climate change-filled wildfires tore their way across eastern Australia. The smoke cloud was so big that the sun turned red in my own homelands, far from the east coast of Australia. At that time, I was supporting my younger brother in hospital, and the doctors told us that they were seeing higher amounts of people with breathing issues related to the smoke in the air. In that moment, our health was bound to the struggle of the land and people in another country. In the impacts of climate change, our fates are intertwined, as are the historic forces that have brought us together today. Before we embark on these 2 weeks of negotiations, it is important to reflect on how we ended up in this room, with thousands of other people masked up and poised to deliberate. And to do this, I must go back hundreds of years into the roots of imperialist expansion and the story of my own community. 252 years ago, invading forces sent by the ancestors of this presidency arrived in my ancestors' territories, heralding an age of violence and murder and destruction enabled by documents like the Doctrine of Discovery that were formulated in Europe. Land in my region was stolen by the British Crown in order to extract oil and suck the land of all its nutrients, while seeking to displace my people and end our practices. The first time I personally experienced these violent processes was at 10 years old, when the local council attempted to steal our community's land for the construction of a highway. And then after that, the New Zealand government stole the foreshore and seabed and offered it up for deep-sea oil drilling the following year. These historic forces continue to shape my life and have brought me here. I have grown up in these negotiations, spending my 20s running through these halls, lobbying decision makers, and staying up far past midnight hand-stitching banners. Since my first climate talks in Paris, I've been giving the same speech. I've been applauded and awarded for conjuring emotive imagery of rising sea levels and yearly wildfires that my community continues to endure. 6 years ago, I first spoke these stories into this space, and every year since, I have repeated the same words: wildfires, sea level rise, wildfires, suffering, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, sea level rise. Emissions continue to rise. I'm the same age as these negotiations. I've grown up, graduated, fallen in love, fallen out of love, stopped and changed a couple of careers along the way, all while the global north, colonial governments and corporations fudge with the future. And as knowing that this history shows us that hands and minds made this present world, and so it is also hands and hearts and minds that can remake it. And it is Indigenous and frontline communities that are leading this remaking. We're keeping fossil fuels in the ground and stopping fossil fuel expansion. We're halting infrastructure that would increase emissions and saying no to false solutions. In fact, in the US and Canada alone, Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual emissions. What we do works. In the face of mediocre leadership, Indigenous peoples shine through. This is all to say that climate change is the final outcome of the colonial project, and in our response, we must be decolonial, rooted in justice and care for communities like mine who have borne the burden of the global north greed for far too long. I cannot put it more simply than that we know what we are doing, and if you aren't willing to back us or let us lead, then you're complicit in the death and destruction that is happening across the globe. Rights frameworks must be entrenched in the Paris rulebook. Finance must be redistributed from the likes of war games in the Pacific towards loss and damage and a just transition. And richer countries have to commit to steep emissions reductions this decade, rather than palming off responsibility through carbon markets. And last but not least, land back, oceans back. This is all part of following Indigenous leadership. This is what keeping warming below 1.5 degrees looks like. This is an invitation to you. This COP, learn our histories, listen to our stories, honour our knowledge, and get in line or get out of the way. Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you, India. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the opening statements of COP26. May I please ask you to remain in your seats whilst we escort our guests from the podium. Distinguished delegates, I now invite the conference to consider sub-item 2B of the provisional agenda, adoption of the rules of procedure. The draft rules are contained in document FCCC/CP/1996/2. Parties may recall that the draft rules of procedure are being applied with the exception of draft Rule 42 on voting due to the lack of consensus. This has been the case since the first session of the Conference of the Parties in 1995. At COP25, the President held consultations and reported that there continued to be no consensus on the matter and proposed that consultations continue at COP26. I therefore propose that we continue to apply the draft rules of procedure with the exception of draft Rule 42. I would like to propose that Ken O'Flaherty of my delegation holds informal consultations on this issue. Hearing no objections, it is so decided. Let us now consider sub-item 2C of the provisional agenda, adoption of the agenda. I wish to thank all parties for their active and constructive engagement in our consultations on the agendas for COP26, CMP16 and CMA3. Whilst parties expressed a range of views, there was a common desire to initiate proceedings swiftly and smoothly today. With the eyes of the world on Glasgow, this will send an important signal to the world that parties remain committed to addressing the global challenge of climate change. Several groups and parties expressed concern about the large number of new agenda items proposed by the parties on top of an unprecedented workload in Glasgow resulting from the accumulation of mandates from COP25 and from 2020 and 2021. I wish to thank Turkey for its flexibility in withdrawing its proposal for an item in the COP agenda. Before presenting the agenda of the COP for adoption, please allow me to first outline my proposals for the agendas of the COP, the CMP and the CMA as they are interrelated. I will also touch on the organisation of work for some specific agenda items based on the consultations conducted and feedback received by the Presidency. Last night, the Secretariat issued documents FCCC/2021/1/Addendum 2, FCCC/KP/CMP/2021/1/Addendum 1, and FCCC/PA/CMA/2021/1/Addendum 2, which contain the revised provisional agendas proposed for adoption by the COP, by the CMP and CMA respectively. These supersede the previously issued supplementary and provisional agendas and reflect a number of understandings and commitments on my part. I hope that all delegations have these documents before them. These documents are the result of intensive consultations held over the past days. I wish to thank all parties for their constructive engagement and their flexibility. In presenting the revised provisional agendas, I wish to provide several clarifications. For the purpose of transparency, I will explain the revisions made. On the proposal for the plurinational state of Bolivia to include an item on the agenda of the COP entitled All Matters of Adaptation, and the proposal by Gabon on behalf of the Africa Group to include an item in the agenda of the CMA entitled Matters Related to Adaptation, with related sub-items, the new proposal in document FCCC/PA/CMA/2021/1, Addendum 2, revises item 4 of the CMA agenda to read Matters Related to Adaptation. This item now includes sub-item A, reports of the Adaptation Committee in brackets 2019 and 2020, and sub-item B, report of the Adaptation Committee in brackets 2021 and the Global Goal on Adaptation. On the proposal by Gabon, on behalf of the African Group, that each item under the Standing Committee on Finance be reflected as separate sub-items, the new proposals provide that sub-item 8B of the COP agenda and sub-item 8A of the CMA agenda be revised to read Matters Relating to the Standing Committee on Finance, with a footnote that would read, recognising the proposal received from Gabon on behalf of the African Group on 17th of August 2021, with a link to the letter from Gabon containing the proposal. I propose to hold presidency consultations on these sub-items. On the following matters, I propose to engage in alternative forms of consultation rather than including them in the agendas. On the proposal by Gabon on behalf of the African Group to include a new item on the agenda of the CMA entitled Special Needs and Special Circumstances of Africa, I propose to hold presidency consultations on special needs and special circumstances of Africa. These consultations will be reported back to me, including setting out a possible way forward. On the proposal by the plurinational state of Bolivia to include in the agenda of COP an item entitled Equitable, Fair, Ambitious and Urgent Real Emissions Reductions now consistent with a trajectory to reduce the temperature below 1.5 degrees, I commit to facilitating discussions on the urgent actions required to keep 1.5 degrees within reach as part of the presidency-led consultations on the overarching cover decisions. This issue will also be addressed through the following special events. The COP26 World Leaders Summit on the 1st and 2nd of November. The headline event of Science and Innovation Day, titled Responding to the IPCC Report, Keeping 1.5 Degrees Alive. This is to be held on the 9th of November. The information event to update parties on the findings of the NDC Synthesis Report to be held on the 3rd of November. On the proposal by Switzerland on behalf of the Environmental Integrity Group for an item in the CMA entitled Reporting and Review pursuant to Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, Provision of Financial and Capacity Building Support to Developing Countries, I will create space through presidency consultations to address this issue and in doing so address the concerns raised by the Environmental Integrity Group. I'm proposing that the following requests be addressed under existing agenda items. On the proposal by Georgia to include an item in the agenda of the COP entitled Achieving Equitable Geographic Representation in the Composition of Constituted Bodies under the Convention, I propose that this matter be addressed under agenda item 2D and request Vice President Mohammed Irfan Tariq to consult on the composition of constituted bodies during his consultations on the election of officers. On the proposal by the plurinational state of Bolivia to include an item in the CMA entitled Stocktake on Financial Support and Means of Implementation for Alternative Policy Approaches such as Joint Mitigation and Adaptation Approaches for the Integral and Sustainable Management of Forests, I propose that parties consider this matter in the context of deliberations on items on matters relating to the Standing Committee on Finance and guidance to the Green Climate Fund. I also commit to following up after COP26 with both the Standing Committee on Finance and the Board of the Green Climate Fund on their mandated work on financial support and means of implementation for alternative policy approaches. Finally, following consultations, I am proposing not to include the proposal by Gabon on behalf of the African Group for an item on the CMP agenda entitled The Third Commitment Period of Annex B Parties to the Kyoto Protocol in accordance with its Article 3, Paragraph 9, and the entry into force and completion of the Kyoto Protocol Second Commitment Period. Regarding the organisation of work, I will propose the following. Under COP Agenda Item 7 and CMA Agenda Item 7, Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage Associated with Climate Change Impacts, I will propose to hold presidency consultations. Further, I propose that the COP agenda be adopted with the following items held in abeyance. COP Item 14, consideration of proposals by parties for amendments to the Convention under Article 15. A, proposal from the Russian Federation to amend Article 4, Paragraph 2F of the Convention. B, proposal from Papua New Guinea and Mexico to amend Articles 7 and 18 of the Convention. COP Item 15, second review of the adequacy of Article 4, Paragraphs 2A and B of the Convention. Dear delegates, with these understandings and with immense gratitude for the flexibility shown by all parties to allow work to begin forthwith, I therefore propose that the provisional agenda as contained in document FCCC/CP/2021/1 Addendum 2 be adopted with items 14A, 14B and 15 held in abeyance. I see that Ukraine has requested the floor. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question whether we are going on each agenda item or now we are going to adopt the agenda as a whole. Because in case we will go step by step by each agenda item, I will have a statement on agenda item 4. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we will now adopt the agenda for the COP, and then I will go through the CMA, etc. I hope that provides the explanation that you require. Thank you. I see that Timor-Leste has requested the floor. Timor-Leste, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Good morning, Excellencies, friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for facilitating the agenda item 7 of the COP and also agenda item 7 of CMA. It has been clear for us that footnote is there, but we need to be sure that both COP and CMA will be receiving a report from the SBs. It means our work here, under the guidance of the SBI and also SAPSTA, will be reported back to both COP and CMA. This is our need and this is our aim. How could we cover all the issues under both COP and also CMA? Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for that. May I just revert to what I said about the organisation of work, and what I had proposed is that under COP item 7 and CMA agenda item 7, Warsaw International Mechanisms for Loss and Damage Associated with Climate Change Impacts, I will propose to hold presidency consultations. I hope that provides the explanation that you are seeking. I see that Ukraine has requested the floor once again. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished delegates, the delegation of Ukraine would also like to ask to defer the consideration of the item 4 of the COP26 agenda. The provisional agenda annotations for agenda item 4 mention that the Secretariat prepared a compilation and synthesis report on the information reported by parties included in Annex 1 to the Convention in their 7th National Communications, 3rd and 4th biennial reports for consideration in this session. However, there is no reference to any specific document available which might be considered under this agenda item by the parties. In this regard, let me recall that at our previous session, there were concerns as to these documents raised by the delegation of Ukraine. Unfortunately, despite the reassurances we received from the Secretariat, the concerns have not been met. Given the need to ensure a consistent application by the Secretariat of the agreed approach, the delegation of Ukraine stands for deferment of the consideration of COP26 agenda item 4. Namely, we refer to the 3rd and 4th biennial reports of the Russian Federation, as well as compilation and synthesis of the 3rd and 4th biennial reports of parties included in Annex 1 to the Convention. We ask to include the statement in the report of COP26. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for the statement, and we note your concerns. I see that Bolivia has requested the floor. Bolivia, you have the floor.
Presidente, distinguidos delegados y delegadas, estamos hoy aquí en esta sesión inaugural de la COP26, representantes de nuestros países y bajo la atenta mirada de los pueblos del mundo que conviven en nuestra casa común, que es nuestra madre tierra. Millones de personas ya han sufrido los efectos adversos de la crisis climática y que después de casi 30 años de negociaciones climáticas nos interpelan pidiéndonos que finalmente demos una respuesta eficaz que permita reconducir la actual emergencia climática global. Bolivia ha solicitado la inclusión en la agenda de la COP26 el tema sobre reducciones de emisiones reales, equitativas, justas, ambiciosas, urgentes, ahora, consistentes con una trayectoria para mantener la temperatura por debajo de 1,5 grados. Este tema ha sido incorporado como el punto 16 de la agenda provisional, pero ya ha sido removido. La agenda de la COP no cuenta ya con este punto como parte de sus temas de discusión, porque no ha existido un consenso de los países para poder incorporar esta temática. Esto refleja que todas las visiones de los países para alcanzar el objetivo de limitar la temperatura en 1,5 grados solamente son declaraciones políticas, sin ningún nivel de compromiso, prácticos y operativos. Pese a que este tema ha sido removido de la agenda, esperamos que la presidencia de la COP pueda encontrar espacios para discutir este tema que es uno de los temas centrales de debate sobre la crisis climática. Una COP de cambio climático no puede ignorar el tema principal de la crisis climática, que tiene que ver con la definición de las soluciones reales y concretas para limitar el incremento de la temperatura. Las siguientes reflexiones realizadas por los pueblos de Bolivia justifican la necesidad que se tiene que poner en marcha un proceso profundo de reflexión sobre la necesidad de alcanzar un incremento de la temperatura consistente, con 1,5 grados centígrados, pero de forma real e inmediata, y no pensando en el 2050. En primer lugar, tenemos que denunciar al mundo entero que la crisis climática no ha sido detenida hasta ahora porque los países desarrollados del anexo 1 han incumplido de forma sistemática sus promesas en las negociaciones climáticas. El protocolo de Kioto ha sido promulgado en el 97 para acordar los compromisos específicos legalmente vinculantes. En primer lugar, el primer periodo de compromisos del 2008 al 2012, los países desarrollados, conocidos como países del anexo 1, se adhieren a recortes insignificantes de emisiones agregadas del 5% en comparación con los niveles del año 1990. A pesar de esta visión muy baja, Estados Unidos abandona el protocolo. El Acuerdo de París ha sido aprobado el año 2011 sobre la base de que los países desarrollados acordarán nuevas obligaciones de reducciones de las emisiones el año 2013 y 2020, en el marco del segundo periodo de compromisos del Protocolo de Kioto. Lamentablemente, las demoras en la ratificación entre muchos países desarrollados hicieron que la enmienda de Doha al Protocolo de Kioto para su segundo periodo de compromisos entre en una vigencia solo el último día del 2020. Los países desarrollados también acordaron en Doha el año 2012 revisar sus objetivos de reducción de emisiones para fines del 2014 y aumentar su nivel de ambición. No solo se elevó el nivel de la ambición, los países desarrollados, de hecho, aumentaron sus ambiciones entre el año 1990 y 2020. Esto junto con la negativa de que algunos países desarrollados, al asumir nuevas metas bajo el Protocolo de Kioto, resaltan su falta de ambición de mitigación. Los países desarrollados han hecho muchos compromisos y nunca los han cumplido. En segundo lugar, tenemos que aclarar al mundo entero que el calentamiento global es el resultado de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero que están consumiendo el espacio atmosférico y que existe una responsabilidad histórica de los países desarrollados con este gasto que no quieren asumir. Durante una propia fase de industrialización, los países desarrollados han abusado de su espacio de carbono y han utilizado el de los países en desarrollo como el nuestro. El presupuesto de carbono para evitar un incremento de la temperatura por debajo de 1,5 grados es cada vez más reducido y estamos a punto de agotarlo. El aumento de la temperatura global, según los últimos datos publicados por el IPCC, del total de emisiones de CO2 que aún podrían ser lanzadas a la atmósfera sin superar el calentamiento global de 1,5 grados, oscilan entre el 67% en probabilidad. Es en estos momentos donde solo 400 gigatoneladas son las que se encuentran en ese rango. Es una cantidad muy reducida teniendo en cuenta que las emisiones globales anuales ascienden a 42 gigatoneladas. Nuestra preocupación tiene sus bases en simples cálculos matemáticos. Las emisiones acumuladas en el 2030 han alcanzado la atmósfera y están ascendiendo en 445 gigatoneladas de CO2 y por lo tanto habremos agotado y sobrepasado en 45 gigatoneladas el presupuesto global de carbono. Es decir, si seguimos con la implementación de los NDC actuales, en el 2030 el objetivo del 1,5 grados va a ser un objetivo inalcanzable porque ya se habrá sobrepasado este umbral. Si los países desarrollados continúan emitiendo y ocupando espacio atmosférico durante los próximos 30 años, las metas globales de la Autoridad Palestina y el objetivo de la Convención no se van a cumplir. Los países desarrollados deberían reconocer esas emisiones de carbono acumuladas históricas y acumuladas per cápita y dejar el espacio atmosférico restante para los derechos de desarrollo del mundo en desarrollo y apuntar a su descarbonización total dentro de esta década. Si continúan emitiendo y ocupando más espacio atmosférico, durante los próximos 30 años las metas globales de la Autoridad Palestina y el objetivo de la Convención no se van a cumplir. En tercer lugar, tenemos que ser absolutamente conscientes que existe una enorme brecha entre las reducciones que requiere la Madre Tierra y los pobres compromisos de reducción de emisiones de los países, que principalmente deben ser compromisos de los países desarrollados, porque son ellos quienes deben tomar el liderazgo de la reducción de las emisiones. Los dos últimos informes del IPCC nos dicen que para conseguir estabilizar el aumento de la temperatura en 1,5 grados, las emisiones de CO2 en el 2030 deberían reducirse en 45% respecto a los niveles del año 2010. El 45% de la reducción debería ser principal referencia en la lucha contra el cambio climático para esta década. El cambio climático, de acuerdo al informe síntesis presentado por el secretario, indica que los índices actuales nos van a llevar en el 2030 a un nivel de emisiones globales del 16,3% por encima del año 2010. Reducir estos niveles de emisiones es responsabilidad principal de los países desarrollados porque ellos tienen la mayor responsabilidad histórica sobre el gasto del presupuesto de carbono y los mayores niveles per cápita de emisiones de carbono. En cuarto lugar, tenemos que denunciar al mundo entero que el llamado de emisiones netas cero al 2050 es un llamado que profundiza la inequidad y la injusticia climática, que nos llevará a un incremento de la temperatura más allá de los 3 grados a fines de este siglo y a una catástrofe global. A pesar de una falta de ambición demostrada en el periodo anterior al 2030, así como en sus índices de acuerdo al Acuerdo de París, los principales países desarrollados ahora están presionando para cambiar los objetivos del Acuerdo de París, al pedir a todos los países que adopten objetivos netos cero para el 2050. Este nuevo objetivo que está avanzando va en contra del Acuerdo de París y es en contra de la equidad y la justicia climática. Las demandas de las emisiones netas cero para todos los países para el 2050 incrementa aún más las desigualdades existentes entre los países desarrollados y los países en desarrollo. Lejos de significar ambiciones climáticas, la frase de emisiones netas cero están siendo utilizadas por la mayoría de los gobiernos de los países desarrollados y corporaciones contaminantes para evadir sus responsabilidades, disfrazando la inacción climática para seguir con las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero en la atmósfera. Las estrategias de emisiones netas cero no están realizando ni tomando en consideración los criterios de equidad y justicia climática. Que el mundo deba alcanzar la neutralidad de las emisiones al 2050 no implica que todos los países debamos alcanzar esta en la misma fecha. Esto constituiría una grave injusticia y vulneración del principio de responsabilidades comunes pero diferenciadas y de las respectivas capacidades, en base a la equidad y a la voluntad de la justicia climática. Los países del norte global deberían alcanzar neutralidad de emisiones mucho antes, mientras que los países del sur podrían alcanzarlas después. Estimados delegados y delegadas, les pido a todos ustedes que por unos minutos levantemos la mirada por encima de los legítimos intereses de los estados a los que representamos y que todos pensemos en conjunto, en conjunto por la biosfera terrestre, por la Madre Tierra y por la humanidad. Han pasado ya 6 años desde la aprobación del Acuerdo de París y en lugar de avanzar estamos retrocediendo. Es triste constatar que el día de hoy los resultados de la implementación del acuerdo son exactamente pobres y preocupantes. El actual proceso de negociaciones de la implementación del Acuerdo de París nos conduce a un cambio inminente en el ciclo vital de la Madre Tierra. De continuar por esta senda, condenaremos al planeta a una sexta extinción masiva y a una gran parte de la humanidad a su desaparición, solo para favorecer los intereses de un sistema capitalista depredador, sin querer frenar el colapso climático. La COP26 tiene que dar un giro radical en la forma como estamos enfrentando la crisis climática. La presente década es decisiva para enfrentar el colapso climático y hablar de promesas para aquí en adelante, de aquí a 30 años, cuando ya será irremediablemente tarde, es una posición irresponsable y suicida con la vida del planeta y de la humanidad. Presidente, delegados y delegadas, para conseguir este objetivo deberíamos ser capaces de aprobar una decisión específica en la COP26 que permita incrementar de forma extraordinaria la inmediata reducción de las emisiones por parte de los países desarrollados del anexo 1. Consideramos que esto debe realizarse en el marco del artículo 4, párrafo 2, inciso D, de la Convención que prevé una revisión de la idoneidad del artículo 4, párrafo 2, inciso A e inciso B, a intervalos regulares determinados por la COP, para que el objetivo se cumpla en esta convención, para permitir que estos elementos deberían contener una decisión de la COP en la siguiente dirección. Deberíamos organizar un grupo de trabajo durante el año 2022 para avanzar en un proceso que permita operacionalizar todos los aspectos necesarios para alcanzar una trayectoria consistente al 1,5 grados. Este grupo de trabajo tendría la tarea de identificar la parte justa del presupuesto de carbono que corresponde a los países del anexo 1, de acuerdo con los compromisos de equidad y CBDR, consistente con una trayectoria para mantener la temperatura debajo del 1,5 grados para el periodo 2023-2030. Los países del anexo 1, en este marco, tendrían que establecer un compromiso vinculante voluntario por parte de las partes del anexo 1, medidas de mitigación extraordinarias adicionales a sus actuales índices, para lograr una reducción real de las emisiones ahora entre el año 2023-2030, en lugar de 0 emisiones netas, como un acuerdo que se representaría en la COP27 el año 2022. También se tendría que definir la provisión de financiamiento y medios de implementación para que los países en desarrollo aumenten su ambición de mitigación y adaptación en consecuencia. Los países del anexo 1 deben tomar la decisión de compensar a los países en desarrollo por hacer su justa y equitativa de presupuesto de carbono, mediante la provisión de financiamiento y transferencia de tecnología, así como para ayudar en la creación de capacidad de esos países. Esperamos que en esta COP26 exista el espacio necesario para discutir estos temas vinculados a las propuestas prácticas para limitar el incremento de la temperatura en 1,5 grados centígrados. Distinguidos delegados, delegadas, presidente, la ciudadanía mundial nos está mirando y nos pide acción. A nosotros nos toca urgentemente decisiones valientes, con una perspectiva global y a la altura de la extremada y delicada situación que estamos atravesando. La responsabilidad que tenemos con las generaciones presentes y futuras y con nuestra madre tierra es cada día más urgente y enorme. Es por ello que como Bolivia hemos convocado una acción urgente y equitativa para lograr una reducción de las emisiones que permita limitar el incremento de la temperatura a 1,5 grados centígrados en el marco de esta COP26. Es un llamado a que los países desarrollados del anexo 1 realicen reducciones de emisiones reales extraordinarias e inmediatas para limitar de forma real y efectiva el incremento de la temperatura por debajo de los 1,5 grados centígrados. Creemos, como Bolivia, que esto es posible. Creemos, presidente, delegados, delegadas, que el día de hoy nos hemos reunido y vamos a trabajar juntos justamente por poder frenar esta crisis climática y enfrentarla entre todos ahora.